So, first a little round of introduction, I guess. That's because you both already did, but you didn't, so...
Hi, Ethan Banks. I'm the co-host of the Packet Pushers podcast. You can find out anything you want to know about me if you Google my name, go to ethancbanks.com, or just look at packetpushers.net. Networking guy would be my focus.
Okay. So, my name is Arjan Timmerman. I'm doing TECHunplugged together with Enrico. Same thing. You can find me on the Twitters as @ArjanTim. So let's start the discussion. Defining software defined. That's a great thing. Defining something. Anyone want to define software defined?
Do you want me to give my angry answer? Or?
The angry one. Yeah, absolutely.
So software-defined has been taken over by the marketing folks to such a degree that it doesn't have a lot of meaning anymore. It used to have a real specific meaning in the networking sense anyway, where we were talking about a central controller running software and then pushing policy down into the network as a whole, all of the network devices. It doesn't mean that anymore because software-defined gets slapped on everything, certainly in the networking space, and I see it showing up with software-defined security and data center and so on now. I do think there is some intent there behind that meaning, but it's so broad that it's become a kind of an umbrella for a whole lot of technologies that I think at their core really have to do with automating infrastructure in some way. Maybe that's a place we could start the conversation.
Yep. Okay. Anyone else?
So I'm more of a traditionalist. It's funny that we're calling software-defined traditional. It's only been a few years that the term has been out, but I also agree but I think the key intent is that we have this control plane that's abstracted away from whether it's the data path, the actual piece of physical infrastructure we're looking to manage, but there's this concept that the control plane is separated, abstracted, and able to manage your infrastructure components with some type of intent that's defined to the user, to that control plane, and then to your infrastructure.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in and have an opinion on that?
I'm reading a lot about lately about surveys with end users, and they are all adopting software-defined something lately. But my problem is very similar to Ethan what said. So, what is software-defined? Because in some cases, it's really difficult to find if it's from the storage perspective, for example. Now everything is software-defined because it's a software, right? It runs off commodity hour. Everything that runs a commodity hour is software-defined. Sometimes it's a technology that we have, since forever, and they just slapped the tag on it. From my point of view, also in the storage, the fact that you have this separation between the controller and the data plane is the real software-defined. Okay, and. But again, so what's your opinion in this? Because sometimes I found different software-defined definitions that fit in.
We're trying to get a definition also, right?
Yeah. I think what you just said for storage aspect, is there a centralized controller in that architecture? I don't think so, right? Because you have the controller VMs, if you will, sitting on these different nodes that's reporting it back, but it's not a true, on the networking aspect, the software-defined architecture, you have a controllers and kind of a, now, if you want to call it dumb hardware devices, and you're pushing out the policies. But in storage, I don't see that same architecture.
Well, I don't know if you want to.
Sure. I wasn't going to pitch my product, but it's exactly the intent we did. What we don't like is when you go into the storage industry, everybody says software defined. Here's a magic array you build, you put some software on it, it's now software defined. And I don't believe that's the case at all. It's just a piece of software running a piece of hardware. It's been the same thing for the last 25 years. It's not new, but when you look at software defined, it's all about separating control plane and data plane. And in storage specifically, put an intent of data where it needs to go. Doesn't mean it's actually going to go there, but the intent is very similar to networking. And that's the definition we're comfortable with. Everybody, I think marketing really has taken over the world, and storage is very frustrating because it's not building an array out of software. That's ludicrous.
Okay.
So do you also think that there are different software defined? Because at a certain point, sometimes, also the virtualization, so the virtualization as we knew it before, even now the hyperconverged and VMware stuff. So we had players. I'm still thinking about storage, that's my field, but there are some, do you remember EMC in Vista, for example, or other platforms? I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the success of this platform, but for example, SVC from IBM was quite successful, and I always thought about it as an additional layer of complexity on top of a complex data center full of different solutions, So from my point of view, it never worked very well, But, I don't know if you think about that as a software-defined solution. So it's virtualization done with a gateway is also software-defined.
So I guess this gets back to why does the term software-defined even appeal to us? Because I think it has some type of appeal to it. And it's getting away from that. I'm all about the abstraction. The title of my header was the abstracted data center. But the question is, what is the business value we're trying to drive by software defining anything? And I think what we can pretty much agree upon is that we need to be able to say that we, as technologists, we intend to do something. We intend to create some type of policy that we want the underlying infrastructure to do. And what we can't do today, we can't go to the CLI of a Arista array, piece of storage, Arista piece of networking gear, EMC piece of gear, or VMware vSAN gear, vSphere, and communicate that intent and configure that intent across all those devices. So we want a layer above that abstracts that and just says, I want a security policy that says this user cannot access this storage, and make it happen. And I think while we have a tough time defining what that is, but that intent-based management, that intent-based layer, I think is what we are looking for in the software-defined world.
So you're thinking more about not the architecture, but the automation, the policy-based engines that we need to enable all of this. So it's not about how it's implemented, but it's more how it's consumed.
I think that's a strong point, and I think what follows along with that is the complexity of the infrastructures and the inability of us to continue along with a human-defined infrastructure. So if you look at needing to react to changes going on in the data center, whatever the circumstances are, we've overloaded this compute node, we need to move workloads around. This section of the network is too busy, we need to move traffic elsewhere. How quickly can human beings deal with that? In a traditional setup, if it's human-defined, if you will, that takes a long time. There's a process to it, and people have to make decisions and so on. Software can be programmed to do a redefinition of what the infrastructure looks like very quickly in reaction to changing circumstances. So I gave a talk last night on software-defined WAN, and that's one of its hallmarks. That's what it does. It will move traffic from one link of the WAN to a different link in the WAN based on changing conditions of those WAN circuits and what policy demands of it, and do it instantaneously with reactions in milliseconds or less based on what policy has been defined and how an application needs to behave in accordance with that policy and which circuit can deliver that behavior. A human being can't do that, but software can. So I think that's an aspect of it that we could legitimately say is software defined. If we begin to move, you mentioned, Enrico, different categories. If we begin to move into a broader sense rather than just the traditional control and data plane separations, then these applications sound plausible as reasonable definitions for software defined.
Yeah, I don't think software defined from a control data plane perspective is interesting, but I think it's not only is it implemented in software, but it's also delivered as a software-only solution on top of commodity hardware. I think when I think software defined, I think of enterprise functionality being delivered on commodity hardware with a download. I mean, that's what software defined means to me. Whether it's automation, whether it's networking, whether it's storage. All those capabilities can exist in a software-defined solution.
I think that's the reality of the market having defined, or marketers perhaps having defined software-defined for us. We end up with all these kind of technologies that mean a lot of things coming under that umbrella. And no matter how we would try to rigidly define it here, it's almost irrelevant because that stamp, the barn door got left open, all the animals are out, and what are we going to do about it now? I'm not sure we can ever contain it.
So even in that point, Ray, I think Ray, a bunch of us have had this conversation about software defined on Slack channels and such. And the one part of the statement of that challenge is a lot of the examples that Ethan gave us from a abstracted layer when we continue to move up and up the stack and we start to get these services from black boxes. And we manage our services from a black box. And AWS is giving you a set of APIs to how you software enable your infrastructure or whatever. And they choose to put ASICs in their x86 servers to make a specific thing run faster. Is that no longer software defined because they chose to deliver a specific part of the service because of the advantages that ASIC drove? The ASIC isn't a commodity piece of hardware. I think, again, it's about the intent and being able to get away from this human-based infrastructure that Ethan talks about.
To add to that, I'm not sure why it needs to be commodity at all, because you could do software defined on all proprietary infrastructure. But the software-defined piece, the intent, the separation, control, and data, it just happens at a higher abstraction than the hardware. Is a cloud commodity hardware, or is a cloud just not a part of your infrastructure that needs to be managed? Cloud has no hardware at all when you look at it from the outside in. It clearly has hardware inside it. And you don't care as long as it has the right price and SLA, right? So as long as you can communicate that intent, I think, yes, DN has had a lot more years defining the software intent than storage has, and it never was marketed as much probably. But they had some really good learnings from that, and one is that the control plane doesn't sit in a data plane. So a software-defined array controller is by definition not software-defined if you're a networking guy, because you should be able to communicate between the app and the endpoint without having to go to the control plane every time. But then there's a lot of learnings to be had from that side.
Actually, I take a bit of an issue with that. I think that the concept of software defined is moving in that direction, but I think so much of it relies on the underlying infrastructure. For example, I think the brass ring in storage is a piece of software that effectively and globally manages your storage infrastructure regardless of what piece of hardware it sits on, and we're nowhere near that. But if we could theoretically disaggregate a complete software infrastructure, management, deployment, policy, et cetera, even tiering of that architecture through the storage environment, simply by a piece of software that really doesn't care what hardware it's sitting on. But even in many cases today, you look at brands that market themselves as software-defined storage. They rely on a very specific reference architecture. Now, it might be a series of different x86 servers sitting in front of it, but it also has, this SAS card or that SATA card or these disks or those disks. And certainly I can't go in and take my old Clarion and manage it with a piece of software. Same thing exists in networking, by the way. We don't necessarily have a full compatibility between NSX and ACI. So the APIs aren't. Yeah, we'll give that to Ethan. The APIs aren't exactly interactable, if that were a word. And I think that it's certainly moving in that direction, but I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be in order for this to truly be a functionality. However, to Keith's point, I think that the concept of let's look at this from a business perspective, leveraging commodity equipment, leveraging a global piece of software to do individual components of your infrastructure is far and away a direction that we want to go, because it increases agility, decreases costs, potentially decreases errors, because when you roll out a policy, for example, to your entire infrastructure, you're really only doing it once. You implement it in NSX, for example, and you push it out to your entire virtual environment, no matter where that stuff is sitting. It's going to be consistent across the entire infrastructure. Of course, that means if you make a mistake, that mistake is also global. But it's easily reparable.
Well, I was going. You mentioned the diversity of managing NSX and ACI, and this would go across the networking field. It doesn't matter what networking tool you've got; they're all rather different. Now, I don't want to give away my talk that I'm going to get up here and chat about in a little bit, but we'll address some of where that's heading. We are making headway in common interfaces that will allow us to normalize the network, if you will. But we are a heck of a long way from that, and NSX and ACI are two very unique products that are not managed together. So.
Oh, the storage side is even worse, quite frankly. I mean, if you look at Scale.io and vSAN and the half dozen software-defined storage solutions out there that are from startups, none of them manage the same way. I mean, it's a bizarre plethora of interfaces that you have to use.
So first off, that guy in the back is pretty smart for a Cubs fan. That's one thing. But the other piece is, I think what we're highlighting is the frustration that from an enterprise perspective that we have. Taking it back to the business piece, we have to give our developers something. A really great question was asked earlier. Are enterprises looking at cloud to solve some of these problems they have internally? And this was the hope of something like an OpenStack, that vendors would write their software-defined interfaces to a common API and OpenStack, and then we could abstract away even that software-defined. So we're trying to, with OpenStack and solutions like VMware vRealize, we're trying to abstract away the abstraction so that we normalize it, because vSAN's software-defined approach to storage is different than even EMC's approach to software-defined storage. So we're looking at stuff like OpenStack and the ultimate abstraction of, and this is what appeals about AWS. AWS, they might be doing 18 different things in their infrastructure, but we don't care. They abstract it away and give us a set of consistent APIs in which we can consume that infrastructure. And I think that's the ultimate goal, is that we're looking for software-defined to give us a consistent way to build our infrastructure and offer it up so that developers and applications can consume it in a consistent way.
Yeah, Keith made the point I was just going to make. The APIs, it doesn't have to be that the one piece of software can work across every vendor. As long as there's APIs, they're well documented. You can put automation, you can put machine learning on top of it. I mean, computers can learn how to talk to their computers faster than humans can ever figure it out. So, especially in the security world, you have to be able to defend against ODA as it's coming at you. So, absolutely right on the API front.
So I guess the question we have in the brownfield environment is, what functional challenges are we looking to solve with software defined? When a sales guy comes to you and says, hey, I have this new software defined widget, what are you hoping is the result of the conversation?
That you buy it.
Yeah, he's trying to solve his quota problem.
From the vendor perspective, obviously.
Can I ask you one more question about the fact that, okay, we don't have a common set of APIs. We won't have it, never, okay? But what happens? So
You don't need the common set using interoperability.
yeah,
You don't need the common set using the common language dictionary to interop.
yeah, but it's okay. Don't add complexity to other complexity. And the idea is, so we are talking a lot about the application. Infrastructure is code now. Okay. So and the complexity is at a level now that we need to move even up in the stack to the application. Okay. Will we obtain the real software-defined only when developers will have access to the infrastructure from this point of view? So not just provisioning more, auto-scaling, but also define the policies. Okay, master policies will be still on the hand of infrastructure guys, but give them the ability to manage in a autonomous way everything, because at the moment they still need someone else to do for them a lot of stuff.
So this becomes the big difference between web scale providers and even the AWSs of the world that push this cloud model into the enterprise. I gave up on the concept of hybrid cloud a while back ago. Plain and simple, most of our developers, for those of us that develop applications, our developers that are developing applications, 90% of those applications are not, I'll go out on a limb and say 90% of them are microservices-based applications. And then you go further out of the view and you see that most of my data center, 90% of my data center is still legacy infrastructure. I'm asked to optimize the way that I run it, but I don't need to run it in a cloud fashion for that to work. So the concept of me exposing my data center APIs directly to the developer makes absolutely no sense. In the ideal world where I'm building web-facing applications and 80% of my infrastructure is the thing that the developer is building, that makes sense. The big question becomes from a software-defined infrastructure perspective, and this is where, as much as I like to call VMware legacy, they have a leg up and saying, you know what, let's just take what we have in VMware and run containers on top of VMs, because we're not changing anything for the infrastructure guys and we're giving the developers what they want for that small slice. And I think those models, as vendors start to adjust to the reality, I think those are the models we'll see where we're taking these fast microservices and cloud native approaches to consuming the data center, but not exposing the data center, the raw infrastructure, and those APIs to the developer directly.
Okay.
Yeah, to build on that, I don't think anybody wants their users to manage storage directly. I think as a user in an enterprise, you probably just want to consume it and have it automatically managed behind the scenes. Developers may be slightly different. I think exposing a set of programmatic interfaces is always helpful. But at the same time, you don't want to, the only way someone can manage an environment properly is actually to understand the environment. And that's the thing you want to see your developers say, you have so many arrays here, here's how it's laid out, I need to do this. You want to consume it at a much higher level. I think OpenStack has been first of all, Amazon is doing great stuff with their APIs because, you know what, if I was a good big storage vendor, like EMC should have offered a single API for their products, not 50 different ones, right? And Amazon has done just that. They're giving the end user as a supplier a single API to do something, which is why it's so powerful. A storage vendor should have figured this out a long time ago that they should have done the same thing. Some have, some haven't. Most haven't. For the end user, I don't think it's worthwhile for them to get access into storage. They just should consume it in a uniform way. And it could be very, very simple. It could be traditional APIs. It could be new REST-based. And it doesn't have to be the same between vendors either, but it has to be a very similar programmatic way of doing it. And it has to be open. The last thing you want is vendor lock-in in a software-defined world. I assume that's something that people assume will happen, but it's not necessarily right. Software-defined doesn't mean it's vendor independent.
The whole vendor independence thing, it's worse and uglier with software-defined because the interfaces are now proprietary and unique. There's a dependency on the hardware underneath, and you've just got your lock-in even higher up the stack now. And there are some open standards that we could all conform to that would help with that, but that's not the way the market has been going, and certainly not the solution most vendors are selling you these days. There's lots and lots of opportunity for lock-in here.
Yeah, on the networking side, I just had a major network vendor come in the other day and gave me a presentation on their kind of enterprise focused solution on how they manage all of the dispersed product lines within their own within their own product line. And I asked the question, well, okay, now how do I manage AWS networking with this? And I got this blank stare of like, wait, why would you want to do that? And I think that highlights that the challenge in the interoperability is that from a enterprise consumer perspective, I want a way to holistically manage my data center and infrastructure, and vendors are a little bit slow in getting to this whole interoperability piece and looking at it from our view of where we're having to really manage very distributed or hybrid environments.
So yeah, primary data, and Doug, is kind of at the cusp of this problem, because if you're actually supporting snapshots and replication for EMC and NetApp and Hitachi, you're talking to all these guys with their own APIs and stuff like that. Is that the case? I mean, so how do you feel about the fact that there is no unique and universal API for storage?
So I spent nearly 13 years with Veritas. We were trying to build just that too, by the way, and it's practically impossible. Every storage vendor likes to offer their own APIs, they like to offer their own differentiation. And there's been numerous storage standards that try to standardize these on management APIs versus access. Access, NFS, SMB is relatively standard. Fiber channel is open and complete these days. But it doesn't make it any easier because you still have to pick, and each one becomes a product silo. You can't have one that fits all. Right? For us, it's as a vendor, you just have to pick the one that's most common. And then you got to it's a prioritization call. I wish there was one that could make it easier. But long ago came to the realization that that's not going to happen. Even let's pick NetApp. They have different APIs between 7 mode and C mode. At least that's only 2. So you could have a lot more, and it's not going to get better as we expand HSL. And it's the reality is when you build a product. I feel for the end user. I've never been an end user. Only ever been on the vendor side, and I can imagine managing so many different types of storage. For example, it's extremely difficult.
Okay. Any other questions?
Good.
Nothing?
So we can go.
Lunch.